Okay, it's just a couple of minutes past 4. I think we'll get started. So I'd like to say welcome to everyone for attending this lecture today. A really interesting, fascinating topic, very timely as well, and a speaker who has in-depth knowledge based on deep research on this question as well. So, as you know, this is the second of several events the department is running in relation to the Russian illegal attack war on Ukraine. We had a roundtable panel discussion last week in person, which was really very interesting, fascinating, and well attended. And then on the 8th of April, we have also a global webinar with voices from the global south, as well as Europe and Britain, on the Ukraine conflict, Russia-Ukraine conflict as well, to try to give a kind of wider variety of perspectives on the question as well. So that the Ukraine war is clearly a very complex question. There's many aspects and many dimensions. And today's event really is looking at the global energy developments, geopolitics, and that particular war, and how those interrelate with one another. And in effect, how the energy orders, which I think Oz is going to explain, and their shifts and transitions in different parts of the world, and what effect they have on kind of geopolitics and therefore conflict and so on. So, and Dr. Oz Hassan, who's joining us today, is ideally suited to speak on this topic. He's associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Warwick, and he's been working on a major project on Qatar and the energy sector, which is led by Georgetown University. He's generally an expert on the United States and national security, but in relation to various parts of the world, including the Middle East developments, and particularly around and including the Arab Spring. So Oz is going to speak for about 45 minutes or so. Actually, he has license to speak as long as he really wants. And then after that, we will move over to a Q&A for members of the audience to either put into the Q&A, type in your questions, but it is also possible that you could ask in person if you like, through just speaking to Oz as well. So without any further kind of stuff from me, Oz, thank you so much for joining us and for making the time. I know how tight everybody's schedules are, how busy you are in particular. You got 100,000 things you're responsible for, I know that. So I really want to thank you for making the time and for sharing your expertise with us on such a fascinating topic and the approach that you yourself take. So please, over to you.
Brilliant. Well, firstly, thanks Inderjeet for inviting me, and thanks to all the participants. Although I can't see you, thanks for sort of attending. Let me sort of share my screen. So there we are. Share. Because it's quite what I'm going to sort of try and present today is quite sort of data or sort of evidence heavy. The title of the talk is The Geopolitics of the Global Energy Transition, and it sort of really takes the US shale, the US energy sort of shale revolution, and sort of looks at this crisis through that lens, and also tries to understand what's going on in the Gulf as well, and what's happening from there. As Inderjeet politely sort of introduced, this project does come from a much larger project funded by the Qatar National Research Fund, of which we've got partners across Qatar, Turkey, and ourselves in the UK. So basically what was happening is that we noticed that energy transitions were beginning to occur, and that geopolitics was beginning to change around energy with the blockade in Qatar and Qatar's sort of role in diversifying it or focusing on liquefied natural gas. So this project predates this crisis, but we began to notice through that research that various things were taking shape that began to lead us to think that this was a possibility and that the geopolitics around this was changing. So what do I mean by this? Well, the central argument that I'm making is that the current crisis in Ukraine actually represents a sort of tipping point in geopolitics, where in fact we're beginning to see a sort of split between the US on one side, China on the other, and sort of non-aligned movement collaborating with both sides in the middle. And that actually the global energy transition is actually providing a sort of fundamental material structure or material structural change within the international system that's helping to cause or allow these energy transitions to occur. I say part because as you'll sort of see as I go along, although I'm focusing on energy today, it's the case that, you know, there's always a sort of multiplicity of causes within any social phenomenon. So although I'm talking about the material aspects today, please don't sort of think that it's a purely materialist argument that I'm presenting. It would very much fall within a sort of constructivist or critical realist sort of lens between the two. So, but the argument is basically this: the Ukraine is actually split in the middle of what is this larger sort of conflict and the role in which energy transition is occurring. So to understand that, what we need to do is we need to look at the sort of lattice work of relationships between natural and social phenomenon within the international system. And this will help us sort of explain not just the specific events, which in critical realist terms is called retrodiction, but also begin to theorize the sort of causal mechanisms giving rise to them. So retrodiction. That's pretty much the framework I'm going to use. And I'm going to sort of use various terms that come from critical realism and complexity theory as I sort of go along, which is the framework I've been looking at this crisis through. But I'm going to try to sort of make sure it's as accessible as possible, even though I'm using that theoretical framework. So if we look at sort of the longue durée of the sort of historical global energy context, what we have is, or what the current literature, the predominant literature says, is that there are four sort of key fundamental transformations of the global energy sector. The first of which began in 1840 and was really the switch from biomass to coal. The second is with the rise of oil from the early 1900s. So 1915 through to 1975, you had oil shifting from around 3% of global energy consumption to around 45%. The third is the rise of natural gas as you begin to sort of shift partially from coal and oil and begin to replace natural gas within the energy mix that's available. So up until 2017-ish, you know, we're talking a shift of from some sort of 3% to nearly quarter of global energy consumption. And then the fourth is the replacement of fossil fuels with low carbon and modern renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, low carbon being things like nuclear, of course. And that shift is beginning, you know, it started in the sort of 1970s, around 6%, and it's now around 16% and rising. So in that context, what we've got is, you know, these sort of four changes. Now, what I argue is something different. But you can see that there's a large shift going on. This is sort of where we are. And I kind of calculated the amount of energy you would need or the amount of energy that we now consume. And we're talking about globally, the amount of energy that the world uses is enough to light up about 102 trillion 60-watt light bulbs. So it's an enormous amount of energy, and that's a real big shift from sort of the 1800s, when really the focus was on biomass, so things like wood and so forth. And so here you've got a diagram that really shows you that what those shifts look like, and the sort of the exponential growth, if you like, of the way in which we consume energy within the modern global economy. And if you break this down, you know, although we've had a lot of talk about fossil fuels versus renewables and so forth, actually what we see is that fossil fuels make up a massive amount of the energy that we use across the globe. So what that means is here is that you can sort of see that in the 1970s, there has been a shift, but it's quite slow, that you've got fossil fuels at around 94%, going through to 2019 at around 84%. Renewables have shifted from 5.6% to 11.4%. You've got quite a large rise in nuclear compared to the 1970s, but in 2000, it's a drop off from the sort of number in 2000, obviously because of the way in which the Japanese Fukushima plant erupted, and sort of went from there. So let me move on to the next slides, because this sort of gives us a rough idea of the overall context. But let me sort of talk about renewables for a second. What's beginning to happen here is that you can sort of see that renewables are part of that mix, a very small part of that mix, but they are the extent in which they are growing is quite large. So in year on year, solar from sort of 2018 through to 2019 grew by 23 or 24%, wind by 13%, and so forth. Other renewables, you've got this sort of growth, and you've got a decline in coal there at the bottom. So this sort of gives the overall picture of energy consumption across the world and the rate of growth. Now, what does this all mean? Well, actually, what we can see is that energy transitions themselves are actually slow, but they move, but the move to renewables is itself accelerating. But what that means is in the short to medium and arguably the long term, we are still going to be reliant on fossil fuels. That's going to be just, what's happening is that there's going to be a change in the energy mix rather than anything else. Now, I said I made a slightly different argument about the sort of four transitions that Shmuel talks about, and I would argue this, that the first three of these transitions are really what I would refer to as morphostasis. That what's happening is that the type of fossil fuels being used, the compositional consistency of the structure, if you like, in which the system's working, is really just adopting a different type of more economically efficient energy to sort of drive that change. So you've got from biomass to coal, coal to oil, oil to gas. That's the sort of mixture, and if anything, that provides quite a sort of dynamic form of stasis within that system. The fourth, however, I think is slightly different in that the fourth is what I would refer to as a sort of morphogenesis, in that there is a fundamental change going on, because you're looking at sort of not economic efficiency changing, but actually trying to meet the demands of climate change and the meta crisis that sort of brings about. So here you've got a sort of different type of change going on. So the geopolitics of energy, if you like, really is getting driven by the interplay between these two different types and the pressures that they cause. So you've got these morphostatic pressures sort of going on as you're switching from one to the other. On the other hand, you've got these morphogenic pressures that are, trying to meet climate change. And there's a range of structural possibilities or leverage between the two. And at the international level, states need to navigate that because of the way in which energy is divided up between the two and so forth. Now, what this means is that we can look at these two things to really, they exist because we have an acceptance of modernity and coloniality, if you like. They are a fundamental part of the way in which we live our lives. They are a fundamental part of how we understand modern development and so forth. So they're not going to sort of disappear anytime soon. Now, if we take the more sort of morphogenic pressures, the sort of fossil fuel part, if you like, the really big change here has been a fundamental transformation in the US energy position over the last decade. What do I mean by that? The obvious answer here is the shale revolution, or the shale gale, as it was referred to in the United States. And here what's happened is that the overall US energy production has increased by 42% between 2000 and 2019. And as someone who's sort of studied US foreign policy for a long time, I remember sort of writing my PhD back in the day, talking about sort of peak oil, energy insecurity in the United States and so forth. Now here, what's happened is those debates have moved aside, because rather than becoming a net importer of most forms of energy, the United States has become a sort of declining importer and a net exporter as of 2019, i.e. it now exports energy, it produces more energy than it consumes, but that's in net volume. So it still imports from different parts of the world, and I'll explain what that means later on. But it's that when you take it all as a whole, it ends up exporting slightly more than it imports. So what's allowed this are the technological advances in energy production that have really sort of been driving home what's going on. And that sort of the technological change here is that, or what's allowed for an increase in production of oil and natural gas, are fundamentally because of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. That's the sort of key part of the shale revolution. And basically what's happened because of these technological changes, the United States has become not just the largest consumer of sort of natural gas, for example, it has also become the largest producer of natural gas. And shale has really transformed the US energy position as a result. So here, if we sort of look at sort of natural gas production in 2020 by sort of country, we can see here that the United States outstrips Russia considerably. The next producer is Iran, and then China, then Qatar, and so forth. But fundamentally, what's happened here is that, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the discussion would have been about how the United States was going to have to import liquefied natural gas onto its shores, and what the energy risk around that was going to be, to now the United States being the largest producer of natural gas in the world. And here you can sort of begin to see what's happening, in that you've got this natural gas production taking off in a very steep sort of trajectory, if you like, from 2008. Just press water. Which is roughly when you can when the shale revolution began to start. If you look at sort of natural gas exports, we can sort of begin to see that, still the sort of leading gas exporter, if you like, or certainly was in 2020. But that position from 2020 through to 2022 began to change somewhat. And in January 2022, for the first time ever, US exports of liquefied natural gas or LNG to Europe exceeded Russia's pipeline deliveries. So what happened is that basically, sort of the United States went from exporting 3.4 billion cubic feet per day in November 2021 to exporting 6.5 cubic feet per day in January 2022. And it was expected in 2022 that the US would already overtake Russia as the world's largest exporter. And that was before the war in Ukraine. So here what we can see is that it's not just a case of, there's going to be a drop-off. In 2020, that's the figure I last gave you, you can see that the expectations of production in the United States are expected to increase rather than decrease, even as the quantity of gas it is pulling out the ground is exponentially much higher than expected. In fact, one of the odd things with Shale is every time there's a geological survey, rather than the fields getting smaller, they're discovering more and more fields, often layered on top of each other, specifically in the Permian. But what you've got here is this enormous natural resource the United States can now take advantage of, that's been allowed because of technology. So in terms of production, you can begin to see that the enormous shift here, that in 2010, the United States was just over 7,000, approaching 8,000, and it's now more than doubled. It's doubled its production rate. Well, what happens in those sort of circumstances is that the United States is now producing around 18.6%, or certainly in 2020, 18.6% of crude oil as well. And that's becoming quite in itself an interesting one as well. So Shale started with gas, then the technology moved on, and then all of a sudden they realized they could also, private companies realized that they could also extract oil using the same sorts of techniques, that the particles of oil were small enough to get through the rock as well. So the USA became the largest producer of oil in the world as well. And so what this has done is, between the sort of discussions at sort of the late 1990s through to 2020, where we are now, is that the debate has changed from one of discussing peak oil and the idea of, when does oil run out? What does modern society look like in those sorts of situations? What does US energy dependence look like? They've now begun to shift to things like peak demand, i.e. that it's no longer the case that the expectation is that oil will run out, but rather we now have oil and gas sort of run out. We now have so much of it, if you like, as a result of the shale revolution, that actually it's more about when demand peaks. And what that means is that you get a debate about, well, what does energy independence in the United States look like? What does it allow the United States to do that it formerly couldn't do? And so you can begin to see here that, the debate over the last 20 years certainly has fundamentally changed. You've now got the United States exceeding more sort of domestic demand, and which allows it to sort of have growing exports. And so this is the petroleum diagram here. Interestingly, the sort of dates here matter, because in 1981, Reagan removed the ban on oil exports of refined petroleum goods. Okay, and what's interesting about that is that crude oil still remained sort of embargoed, if you like. You couldn't the United States couldn't export crude oil, and this is sort of a legacy of the 1970s oil crises. But in 2015, that began to change. So already you can sort of see, just with petroleum exports, that from 2010 through to 2020, the United States sort of exports of petroleum exponentially grew compared to sort of the 1950s and so forth, just because they could get it. But here is what happened in 2015, when US exports of crude oil get permitted. Now, what happened is that on December 18th, 2015, US legislation actually removed the ban on crude oil exports and allowed that to happen. And all of a sudden you can see here that you've got this just exponential change in exports that the United States can engage with. Because the argument in the United States was that actually the exports themselves, banning their own exports, was a form of self-imposed sanctions. And so what you get sort of, by the end of 2015 is that all of a sudden crude oil starts getting exported to from Texas through to France. And European powers really begin to say, actually, energy security, in light of the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, that's a big deal. we want to get access to this, and we want to sort of make sure that that we can begin to diversify. And the US position is, at this point, is that US exports to friends and allies actually bolsters the US security, as well as those friends and allies security, but also enhances the US international position. So all of a sudden, this is sort of, these are the diagrams that that sort of show sort of, the overall import-export mix, is that very late on in 2020, for the very first time since, a tanker arrived in 1948 from the Middle East, you've got the United States actually being net energy independent. That ultimately, it's exporting more than it consumes, and it's able to get what it needs from North America. And so this creates this North American energy independence that actually, most of its petroleum it can get from Canada, and that really begins to change. It only sort of gets 8% from the Persian Gulf at the minute. This isn't a sort of big deal compared to sort of its reliance even in 2008 of 30% from the Gulf. So you've got this sort of sense in which the United States is now completely independent, if you like, of of ties to its former sources. And that begins to change some of these relationships, because all of a sudden the United States is far more dependent on Canada and Mexico for larger chunks, i.e. from North America, for its imports, but also its exports. And for the first time, it begins to even sort of export it begins to export oils to China and so forth, and begins to sort of get more involved in Europe. It becomes a sort of global, the United States sees a global market available to itself that formerly wasn't there. So what's happened here to the United States is that all of a sudden the United States jumps up and becomes one of the big three energy producers. So it's now a rival to Saudi Arabia and Russia. And so that has fundamentally changed the global balance, or the energy balance, within the international system, and reduced the US dependency on oil from abroad almost entirely. So there are no more fears about the sort of vulnerability of the 1970s, that that the United States could be held to ransom, and that the Gulf, like OPEC could have power over it, and so forth. Those sort of, it has availability, it has access, and it has the flows of energy it needs to sort of keep keep the lights on, if you like. And so that trade alters the sort of US trading position, with, all of a sudden its trading balance is 309 billion lower in 2009 than it would have been without Shale. Shale creates millions of jobs throughout the United States now. It's also sort of, the United States is also able to invite sort of foreign investment into it because of the abundance of low-cost natural gas. So, for example, some Chinese companies have been shipping chemical manufacturing from China over to the United States because of the low cost of natural gas. And so what you've got is this sort of pausing, if you like, or reversing of American decline, that all of a sudden the United States has altered its global strategic position, that it's no longer sort of reliant, and it's got this flexibility that it wasn't there before. And that in itself allows it to impose sanctions in a way that it wasn't able to do previously. So we saw that in 2012 with Iran, where, geopolitics, if you like, the geopolitics doesn't affect the energy prices in quite the same way as it did in the 1970s, because the United States has been able to feel, albeit with lag, within the system have been able to sort of fill various gaps as and when they emerge. In 2017, that happened with Russia, and 2019 over Nord Stream 2 as well. But in effect, the vulnerability for the United States with regards to energy really exists in the overall world economy. I spelled that wrong, apologies, and of its trading partners, because in effect, the United States, 30% of GDP relies on the global economy functioning, and that's about 40 million US jobs. But that's where the vulnerability is there. It's not a case of, the United States having this enormous energy demand that needs to be met from abroad. So what that means is, in one sense, this has removed a level of competition between the US and China. So, with the US exporting oil to China, for example, that's, they're obviously not competing over crude oil in that way. But what it has actually done is it's reintroduced a level of competition within within the international order of energy producers. So, in effect, what the United States, and certainly under the Trump administration, did is it moved from saying that energy politics should be politics, it shouldn't be it shouldn't be securitized, we shouldn't talk about energy in sort of political terms, it should really be markets. All of a sudden, the Trump administration begins to talk very much in terms of competition. It begins to promote American energy abroad. It begins to tie that with various contracts with, say, for example, South Korea and so forth. And the Trump administration really begins to sort of push this. And so Shale begins to compete with Russian energy in Europe. And Putin's sort of response to that was made clear at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, where in effect, someone mentioned Shale, and he absolutely goes nuts, and he sort of denounces shale gas as a great threat that needs to be stopped. He begins to warn about how actually, we need to stop developing the United States and others need to stop sort of exporting this because it's an existential threat, and that it's bad for the environment and so forth. And he also begins to talk about or warning against the development of shale in Eastern Europe. And by that, we know that Ukraine is the largest it has the largest endowment of natural resources, energy resources in Europe. So by implication, that's referring to the Ukraine. So, but what this competition does, by having this abundant amount of energy that's now accessible because of technology, is that Russia's energy leverage from its geological endowment, actually gets weakened. So, in effect, the shale revolution runs directly against Putin's ambitions to start to have sway over the Soviet Union, to restore Russia as a great power, to build new alliances in and around energy. And it also sort of runs against Putin's sort of desire to push back against the US and Europe and various forms of democratic governance. And certainly the color revolutions that I'll speak about very shortly later really begin to sort of bring that home. So all of a sudden, you've now got, this Russia's main geopolitical tool being threatened. And that is because of the shale revolution. So how does it sort of threaten Russia, if you like? Well, overall, Russia's sort of oil and gas provides around 40% of its federal budget and makes up around 60% of Russian exports. So in terms of fossil fuel rents, it amounts to around, or certainly did in 2019 to 20, around 14% of the Russian GDP. So in effect, like in one way, one of the sort of ways in which Russia is spoken about is that in many ways its economy is a giant sort of gas station. it's so reliant on this resource curse and the sort of weaponization of energy that, you know, that's kind of been Putin's grand sort of position, that actually, you know, its global position is leveraged through energy. So here you've got sort of the overall export values and so forth. I won't go into now, but if we sort of look at, you know, the overall sort of energy mix, if you like, that actually Russian crude oil mainly goes to China, then sort of the Netherlands certainly did in 2020, and Germany and so forth. So that's where oil sort of goes. But if we then look at gas in terms of Russian exports and through pipelines really goes to Europe, right? That Europe is almost entirely dependent. I think, you know, I think 60% of all gas sort of exports, Russian gas exports, go to towards the European Union. Around 50%, I think it is, of oil exports, and sort of 50% of petroleum products as well. So what you've got is this sort of, you know, incredible energy reliance sort of going on. But that's beginning to get cut back, and it's beginning to get cut back over time. So here you can sort of see the shift from 2019 through to 2020, in part because of COVID there. And that's an absolutely crucial part of this dynamic of what happens with COVID. But in effect, in 2021, the European Union imported 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia, accounting for around 45% of the EU's gas imports, and close to 40% of its total gas consumption. And that's where we are. And where does it come from? It basically comes through these pipelines here. And as you can see, the sort of three main pipelines in green, completed pipelines in green there, that go through Ukraine. And that becomes incredibly important, because what it does is it places Ukraine really in the middle of this overall conflict, and the leverage. So Ukraine, in effect, is stuck in the middle of, you know, this global change within energy, but also within the particular circumstances of its geographical location. So in 1918, Ukraine gets declared, but basically becomes a co-founding Soviet republic in 1922. In 1991, it gains independence, and the Ukrainian Socialist Republic becomes just Ukraine. The Budapest Memorandum, you know, removes nuclear weapons from Ukraine in recognition of everyone adhering to Ukraine's borders and so forth. And the question for Ukraine is, does it look west? Does it look east? And there's a sort of big debate about that. Now, none of this mattered when the USSR existed, because it was all in effect one country. But now it does, because of Ukrainian independence. So gas is at the heart of the Russian dependence on Ukraine. And that's specifically what I mean. Russia is dependent on Ukraine, right? And what do I mean by this? Well, in effect, the pipelines that go through, 80% of the gas exports to Europe pass through Ukraine's pipelines, predominantly through the Brotherhood pipeline. Brotherhood being because, you know, at one point they all regarded themselves as one country and one peoples. But Ukraine, in effect, gets to charge tariffs on these Russian exports to Europe. And for a while, that's not a problem. But then you start getting the color revolutions. You start getting Yushchenko looking west. You start getting the spread of democracy through Eastern Europe beginning to threaten Russia. And at the same time, Moscow wants to start taking control of Ukraine's pipeline system. And Yushchenko sort of says no, and sort of says these are sort of crown jewels. And so you start to get Putin using the energy weapon. In 2006, this started with Gazprom cutting off all gas to Ukraine. And the Ukrainian response was to siphon off gas that was intended for European countries. In 2009, so in effect, it didn't work. In 2009, Russia done it again. So 1st of January 2009, Russia cuts off gas to Ukraine again. This time, there's absolutely no effect, because what Ukraine has done is it built up storage in advance to make sure that through the heating season, there was enough gas available. So in effect, the raw energy power that is key to the Russian foreign policy or Russian statecraft is they try to use it against Ukraine, and Ukraine basically is able to sort of to get around it. And in effect, this is upsetting European energy security. So you start to get, pipeline, the Russians sort of dealing with pipelines like Nord Stream, Yamal, Blue Stream, and so forth, beginning to shape the system. You've got Angela Merkel sort of referring to markets, not relationships, that she wants, and so forth. So Germany is very much in the center of this. But at the same time, you've got the European Union saying this is crazy, we're relying too much on Russian energy, and there's no consensus. But ultimately, and this is before the shale revolution, really, that you've got the Russian energy weapon against Ukraine not working. So the next approach the Russians sort of adopt is sort of almost by accident, really, is that Putin sort of, the Russian regime has this idea of the Eurasian Economic Union, of pulling Ukraine back into its sphere of influence. And at the same time, you've got the European Union pursuing this sort of technocratic EU association agreement. And never should the two meet. It's a case of, one set of things going on, another set of things going on, and no one really knowing what's going on with any of these. But all of a sudden, the Russians realize that if a EU association agreement gets signed, then it kind of ends the Eurasian Economic Union agreement, and sort of the movements there. So in effect, what happens is Putin starts to get quite agitated. He begins to talk about Ukraine as not even a country. What is Ukraine? It's part of its territories in the Eastern Europe, but it's really a gift from us, and so forth. And here, this is why in 2013, you get Ukraine really withdrawing from like quite last minute from the from various treaties and so forth. You then get the protests, and you get the sort of government collapsing and going to Russia and so forth. And you've got all of these sort of things going on. But the key point here is that Russia's attempts to create a sort of economic interdependence, that's also failed. And so by 2014, you've got this Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea and the idea of reunification with Russia. So what all this is beginning to build up to is the realization in Russia that Ukraine is very much looking west, that Russia has a dependency on Ukrainian pipelines. The United States is in part opposing the building of new pipelines like Nord Stream 2. And increasingly, you've got this sort of post-2014 environment where all of a sudden, the energy weapon that, you've got economic interdependence failing, and you've got the energy weapon failing. And really, Russia's positions in Europe is getting eroded because of shale imports to Europe, a growing LNG, and the growing number of LNG terminals. I think by that point, we've got this change from, I think, about 4 or 5 terminals up to 30 or so forth. And then in 2019, you've got the election of President Zelensky, and at first, by December that year, it really looks like this is settled, that Russia and Ukraine, they settled the dispute. Gazprom sort of agrees to give Ukraine $3 billion in arbitration. You've got these 5-year guaranteeing gas volumes and so forth. And Ukraine really shifts its imports of gas from Slovakia. Basically, the Ukraine basically shifts its imports away from Russia and then starts to import from Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. In effect, that may well be Russian gas, but it's not coming directly from Russia. Ukraine also then starts producing 66% of its own domestic supply. And all of a sudden, you've got Ukraine no longer dependent on Russia for its energy. In effect, the energy weapon has been completely neutralized there. So in 2021, this is where it starts getting interesting, that I think the Russians began to realize, certainly by the end of 2021, that their overall ambitions and the tools they have for it are no longer kind of, there's a sort of moment, if you like, that all of a sudden it becomes rather obvious that you've got these ambitions to take control of your sphere of influence, but all of a sudden the tool you have for it, or the tools you have for it, are no longer working. You can't use the gas weapon, and you can't use economic interdependence as a sort of form of colonialism. So therefore, what begins to happen is that Russia begins to start to make preparations for that. In part, we sort of, the first signs of that for me certainly were when Russia, the IEA released a note sort of saying that Russia was meeting its long-term contracts, but not actually filling up European gas storage. So it was around 30% below average for the heating season around the end of 2021. And at that point, as a side note, there's this thing called super forecasting, a website where you sort of put in what your predictions over whether you think an invasion will happen. Based on this information, I did make a super forecast and did predict a full-scale Russian invasion as early as as very early in January this year. But what you've got here, and how I made that calculation is, if you like, is that you've now got a sort of Western-facing Ukraine with a flawed democracy, right on Russia's border, not able to use its weapons, a Russia that wants to change the international system. It sees Ukraine as a competitor that has various forms of control over its energy policy, and in effect, Putin wants to rewrite international norms. So that's what you've got. Now, interestingly, where some of this thinking comes from, if you like, is the 2014 energy price collapse. And I think that this brings home the importance of Shale to this entire debate. That in 2014, by exposing Russian vulnerability, actually, in 2014, you had energy prices collapsing and exposing an existential risk to various Gulf states, but also to Russia, those energy-powered states. And what you get in 2014 is this massive supply glut, where there's a sort of low economic responsiveness from oil importing countries. Just not, production's up there, but no one's sort of buying it. All of a sudden, that Russia and and the Gulf start to realize the Asian market isn't purchasing as much as they want. But of course, in 2014, there was this assumption that $100 a barrel oil was in effect, what you would base your budget on. But all of a sudden, the oil price drops to $35 to $45 a barrel. You lose massive amounts of revenue, or oil price volatility occurs, and all of a sudden from there, what you've got is the sort of brick era, as we sort of refer to it, giving way to the oversupply of these products because of Shale. So we enter the Shale era. So that's the effect it sort of has. Now, the 2014 period here becomes incredibly important to the realization that the Russian weapon, if you like, is weakening. But it's also the point in time when Gulf states begin to reevaluate their entire sort of ethos around energy. And that begins to sort of show itself with greater coordination in sort of OPEC plus model. So at this point then, that you've got you know, some really interesting things start to happen sort of globally that sort of begin to feed in to this debate. In 2014, the energy price collapse really changes Saudi Arabia's thinking, for example. You know, it's where this idea of peak demand comes from, that actually, you know, global supply, there's a sort of is there, but actually we're not going to run out of it, that it's not quite the finite resource that we thought it was, and that slowly but surely energy demand is going to start dropping off. At the same time, in Saudi Arabia, you've also got increasing domestic consumption, which creates the worry that actually Saudi Arabia might become an oil importing nation. At the same time as this is sort of going on, you've got sort of politics around climate change and things starting to happen with technology around the electrification of cars, robotics, AI, 3D printing, ideas about green hydrogen, and so forth. And that all of a sudden, the sort of thinking around the future of energy begins to change. That ultimately Saudi Arabia, for example, requires $65 to $85 a barrel to balance its books post-Arab Spring. Russia needs around $42 a barrel to sort of balance itself out. And that's where this idea of sort of OPEC plus comes from. And in 2017, you have sort of King Salman coming along and sort of saying that he wants a relationship beyond oil, and that actually we need greater cooperation with Russia in terms of investment, military, weapons, technology, and so forth. And Putin sort of turns around and says, okay, well, we'll turn from rivals into partners if this is sort of what happens. And so whilst this is sort of going on, you've got this OPEC plus model occurring where all of a sudden Russia and Saudi Arabia are beginning to work together and begin to sort of try to coordinate where they are in terms of oil price in order to maximize their needs. At the same time, you've got Saudi Arabia saying, actually, we need to diversify our economy. The UAE's had the same debate with their Vision 2030, and Qatar has as well. But really, what this means is that those countries are trying to use their sovereign wealth funds, the Public Investment Fund, to sort of, go out and buy, investments all over the globe. And to use the revenue from those investments and to use oil money to build a new society, with this new city, the Strip, Neom, in the north, to sort of rely on sort of becoming more sort of artificial intelligence hubs, that sit between sort of the US, Russia, and China in the middle. You've got Mohammed bin Salman sort of trying to consolidate his own power at the same time as sort of allowing for various social reforms. So you've got some changes there as well as a result of the sort of global, and all this points to that sort of weakening, if you like, of energy as a strategic tool. It's, the writing's on the wall and gets recognized. And really, what the sort of the part of that becomes really interesting, if you like, is in March 2020, when we see the largest drop of oil price ever seen, and basically a 25% collapse in global demand. That in effect, COVID, and as sort of social distancing began to turn into lockdowns, you've got a massive crash in oil, where all of a sudden oil doesn't just not sort of pay, it doesn't go to zero. All of a sudden you've got people storing it and you're having to pay for storage, so oil it unbelievably goes negative. And and that has a profound effect on the sort of mental part of that. But what's interesting about this, and I think that this is where it gets interesting for me, is that the OPEC plus begins to sort of falter, and that Russia and Saudi Arabia, although they want cooperation, they can't agree on what that cooperation looks like. And so Saudi Arabia makes the decision that actually it is going to increase production whilst prices are falling. So that doesn't make economic sense. But for the Saudis, this is a form of statecraft. Now, this profoundly irritates Russia because all of a sudden, Russia can't sell its energy abroad. But what the Saudis were trying to do, and where the complexity of this relationship sort of comes in, and one of the reasons Russia regards the writing on the wall in terms of its overall the utility of its energy policy, is that a price war kicks out, and Saudi Arabia decides that it's going to start fighting for market share. That in effect, if with barrels of oil so low, then US shale companies start to go out of business. The Saudis have basically made that calculation that they are going to try and bankrupt shale companies so that when they come out of COVID, they can shoot the energy price up. So what that does is, you can see here that all of a sudden this puts the United States and Saudi Arabia in direct tension because of the volume Saudi Arabia is pumping out. So quite the opposite of the oil crisis of the 1970s, where it was restriction where the conflict came from. Now, of course, the pumping out that energy from Saudi Arabia, it turns into a form of economic warfare. The United States says that you're sort of intentionally inflicting pain on shale producers, and basically they sort of said, well, if you're behaving like this, then we're going to start removing security guarantees. Saudi Arabia under OPEC Plus sort of says, well, actually it's Russia, that Russia won't come up with an agreement. Now, what begins to happen at this point is that it really begins to threaten US energy dominance. So Trump, through the G20, negotiates the largest supply cut in history. So all of a sudden, the US, as one of the big three, has an interest in keeping prices higher and making sure shale companies sort of survive. But what this does is it means that Saudi Arabia is now in direct competition with the US, and that is actually reliant on coordination with Russia. And that creates this new period, if you like, of complex adaptation within energy policy and within US-Saudi Russian relations. So this is on top of some quite fundamental changes in the Middle East as well, with the geopolitics of the Shale revolution sort of really changing some of the lattice work. And I'll list these because I don't want to sort of go into them too much, because I want time for Q&A. But in effect, what you've got is, the US not relying on the Middle East for its own energy security, but really Saudi Arabia and the UAE becoming sort of the players with the most spare capacity within the international system. So that allows them to sort of leverage up and down quite quickly the amount they can do. I believe the Saudis and the UAE have got something like 22 billion, I think it's 22 million barrels a day they can pump out. Qatar has become the sort of LNG seller of last resort. Increasingly, you've got Saudi Arabia and the UAE looking towards the Chinese market to sort of balance out, to balance out Iran, because of Iran's involvement with the Belt and Road Initiative. Iran's becoming far more important to China than Saudi Arabia and the UAE. You've got Russia sort of looking to coordinate prices. At the same time as you've got, the Saudis relying on high energy prices to fund Vision 2030 and their energy transformations. At the same time as you've got this going on, you've got an energy revolution in and of itself occurring in the Eastern Mediterranean with gas from Israel, which I believe Germany has just approached, I think today, trying to work out how they can replace Russian gas from Israel. You also have energy independence in Egypt. So you've got energy shifts occurring in the Levant region. At the same time, you've got the US and Iran potentially re-entering the JCPOA, so the Iranian nuclear deal. I think that probably will occur and quite soon from the looks of it. And the Saudis, in effect, are sort of are competitors with the US and increasingly sort of working with Russia, but sort of trying to balance between the two. So overall, where does this sort of deliver us then? Well, in effect, North American energy integration has really increased US national security flexibility. You've got the shale revolution and renewables weakening Russia's energy position and reducing the overall leverage that that Russia has on Europe, and it's now beginning to erode further. I'll talk there's a projection from the IEA at the minute that just with 10 sort of minor, 10 reform, the EU has said that that the European Union probably has enough gas at this point to last the rest of the year. The IEA thinks it can that Europe can reduce by a third its dependence on Russian energy within the next 6 months, using what it's referred to as its 10 steps. There's an idea of going back to coal and oil for a brief period until the market resorts itself out, to keep the European energy. Things going on like that. But what all this is pointing to, and where this is sort of coming from, is that this does not point to a rising Russia. This is not the sort of Russia that is part of the BRICS and that, is going to be one of the world's next economies that is fantastic. It actually points to the fact that Russia has been in decline, and that actually it's incredibly dangerous because of that decline, as it's forcing to adapt, and it no longer has the tools to reach to meet its objectives, and therefore it's becoming that overly sort of over-reliance on energy as a weapon is beginning to erode, and that's why it's being forced to sort of coordinate with Saudi Arabia for its own long-term economic survival, and that sort of helps us to sort of understand why some of the changes are occurring in a material sense. So in effect, what we've got here is this sort of renewed period of geopolitical rivalry, and a new form of Russian imperialism as a result of that, if you can't use the oil weapon, if you can't use a sort of second phase of colonialism through economic forms of domination and integration, then actually, Russia seems to sort of go to the first sort of type of imperialism. You've got the Gulf states sort of seeing an existential threat occurring, and which is why they need coordination, more important on the sovereign wealth funds, different visions with Vision 2030 and so forth. And what these sort of trends are beginning to point towards are really the emergence of a sort of 3 gravitational blocks of sort of norms, if you like, or what I would refer to as norm circles. Within the international system, you've got the sort of US and the EU coordinating, you've got China, of which Russia and Saudi Arabia are beginning to align and begin to look towards the Beijing consensus. And you've also got these sort of non-aligned states such as India, who've got dependent interests between the two. And in effect, what this means is that, as it currently stands, is that various forms of globalization are going to continue, excluding Russia, but the energy policy has fundamentally changed the nature of that and has introduced a new form of global rivalry. I think that's probably enough there, Indrajit, if that's okay.
Wow, that's fantastic, Oz. Thank you so much for that. I mean, that's a huge amount of interesting empirical material and their effects. And I would like to thank you, first of all, for that wonderful talk. And I've been sort of scribbling notes as quickly as possible, try to think through what you've been saying and think of some questions, of which I have many. But I would like to ask the audience, please, to put your questions into the Q&A. And I think, Tanya, maybe I'll to unmute you as well if you would like to ask kind of in person through voice. But just to start off, so you predicted that that Russia would invade the Ukraine after January this year, from the calculations that you had made as a result of the kind of energy shifts that you described and explained.
Yeah, I think so. There's a website called I forget I forget the exact name of it. But it's a website that where you do super forecasting. And what it does is it gives you a set of questions and a set of parameters well in advance, and you have to sort of begin to make strategic forecasts based on those. So it'll ask you questions like, do you think the United States will rejoin the JCPOA? Yes, within this time frame. Yes, no. And then it does a whole series of calculations to work out your overall accuracy. So that's something I've been sort of doing overall, but yeah, it's one of those sort of things that often in international relations, folks are very good at making predictions and so forth, but they're so fuzzy that they could have meant anything at any point in any way. Clash of civilizations, for example, being a sort of classic one that you can sort of do, that you can sort of see evidence and things like that. What this does, it sort of forces you to pin it down. So all the evidence, if you like, was pointing towards that. A prediction was made, and overall it proved very accurate.
Right. So you would say then that the U.S. intelligence, which had actually correctly predicted this particular invasion, was correct.
Yeah.
I mean, do they not use this model as well?
Well, interestingly, this model came out of an experiment with the CIA, I believe it's CIA, or it might have been DARPA, where they found that various people were able to make predictions incredibly accurately just using open source data.
Right.
And so I think they still run competitions with it.
Right. Okay, we got a question for you, Oz, from Elwyn Jones, who sends his greetings to all his friends at Warwick, and would ask for you to provide any insights on the following critical questions or linkages. He says that famine in the global south is relieved by the World Food Programme. The World Food Programme buys its grain from Ukraine. The Ukrainian harvests are dependent on chemical fertilizers. Synthesis is very energy intensive. A lot of that energy comes from Russia. So what are the prospects of starvation in any part of the world? And Elwyn asks about Russia, about Africa, sorry.
Okay, so they are severe. I haven't sort of covered Africa, but I can speak, for example, in Afghanistan, there probably will be a famine will probably be declared. In Yemen, a famine will probably be declared. In Egypt, Egypt has just turned up at the IMF precisely because it can no longer afford the sort of grain that it usually imports from Russia and the Ukraine. And so what you're getting are these sort of knock-on effects where this conflict is exacerbating sort of global hunger in overall and in the round. Like that's a direct consequence. And one of the studies I've seen on this has looked at, if we go back to sort of Syria, that what part of the reason the Syrian war occurred, if you like, is that there were bread riots. It's quite often in the Middle East that you do get bread riots and so forth, but environmental damage and so forth was one of those causes. So in effect, if we sort of think that through, we can sort of begin to think about a massive amount of social unrest across the world as a result of this conflict and the hunger it will cause.
Thank you. Tanya, if you're online, Sean Stars would like to ask his question in person. Is it possible, please, to unmute Sean?
Yes, I'll do that now.
Thank you. So as soon as you're ready, Sean, please do. You're muted at the moment, Sean. There
Hello,
you go.
Can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. Yeah, sorry, I just want to ask him first. Yeah, so thank you very much for an incredible talk. I mean, so much detail. I'm still trying to process everything, but I just have two questions. First of all, so you said Ukraine has the largest, at least potential shale reserves in Europe. Has the U.S. been trying to develop that? Is that what Hunter Biden was doing with Burisma? And two, maybe more of a challenge than a question. Like you're predicting that Saudi Arabia is going to be more closely aligned with China, but I really don't see that in the medium term. So I mean, like 70% of Saudi arms come from the U.S., 13% comes from Britain. So I mean, that's incredible security dependence on Anglo-America, and of course, this Saudi currency is pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the petrodollar is extremely important. And I don't think the RMB is going to be anywhere near as globally traded as the U.S. dollar, and other reasons. So how likely do you think that will happen, that the Saudi Arabia will align with China? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah. So obviously the US itself, as an entity, does not sort of aid with the development of shale, but American companies certainly have been looking at those opportunities. With Burisma, I think Burisma produces or is responsible for only about 5% of Ukrainian energy. Domestic energy production. I think that's right. I'd need to check figures, but I think it's 5%. There's a much larger company that does most of it. But in terms of overall sort of shale potential, it looks like, and I'm not a geologist, so I don't know, but it does look like there is the potential, or certainly there was a fear in Russia that there is the potential for that to occur. That's pretty much all I was saying. That in terms of China and Saudi Arabia, I think what's beginning to occur there is not a direct strategic alignment of Chinese and Saudi sort of partnerships, if you like, but there are an alignment of interests beginning to occur. So, for example, if as Saudi Arabia tries to balance against Iran, it will try and seek further favor with China, precisely because China regards Iran as more important for the Belt and Road. So, after the Arab Spring, the Chinese regarded the Suez Canal as problematic, and so they started to want to build over land, and that's why Iran became more important, just because of its geographical location. So China and Iran have been working that sort of way. So in terms of Chinese-Saudi relationship, what I would say is that the Saudis increasingly find working with the Democrats in the US, certainly after Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated, as problematic. And so what you're getting is the Saudis looking around the globe to sort of balance out, but not necessarily. So, we're not talking a sort of direct partnership in the same way the US and China, the US and Russia, the US and Saudi Arabia has, but you are beginning to see changes in the Saudi position towards Russia. And so what you're getting is this really, really important trilateral relationship between the Saudis, Russia, and China beginning to emerge. I think that's the best way of me describing it, that the adaptation within the system is about those three aligning rather than a sort of strong bilateral relationship with China itself.
Right. Thank you. Sean, do you want to come back on any of that, or are you happy?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Sean. We got a question in the Q&A from Pedro Silva, one of our guests, who says that you say that there's a tendency of three emerging norm circles, but do you see any kind of is this like a irrevocable shifts, as in divisions and splits and contradictions, or is it kind of like something less of a kind of kind of split, but just sort of shifts and rearranging relationships and rebalancing kind of relationships? And Pedro asks whether the UN system or any other international system might coordinate or help to sort of manage the conflicts and tensions that may arise from these three, what you call norm circles. Just before you answer that, I'd like to ask you a question about norm circles and your term, norm circles. Everything you said in your lecture is about material shifts in the energy distribution of power. So energy has shifted, has changed, if you like, where it's produced, who's got the leverage, who hasn't, and the kind of relations that are changing as a result of it. But in your characterization of the three emerging blocks or kind of new kind of identifiable elements in the world, you call them norm circles. So I'm just wondering, the driver seems to be energy and technology, but you refer to the three blocks as norm circles. I just wondered about that.
Yeah. So this is a term that comes from a critical realist called Dave Eldervass in sociology. And he goes to great length to sort of, so the critical realist premise is that the world is material, that ultimately that materiality is incredibly important, and that, but what you get is, as things come together, you get different emergent products. And so he says that the social, the theory about norm circles is that what you get is the social emerging from the material as a result of emergence occurring and creating different things at different levels. So he basically, you know, the way it's sort of used is to explain that, you know, you have a materiality as a body. That material body allows the mind to occur. The mind produces ideas. That those ideas produce norms, and then various elites or social groups begin to build up norms around those of what's acceptable and not. So it's a way of traversing the divide between material and ideas. So that's why it's a very specific term that I'm using.
Okay. And what about the question Pedro asked about these three emerging blocks and the tensions?
So I think that the real shift here is away from sort of the WTO consensus towards trade conflict and the geopolitics that comes with that. So, you know, we've seen trade wars break out between the US and China, you know, under Trump and the Trump administration over, you know, what he regards as, you know, what he regarded as the worst sort of deal ever, and so forth. And I don't think that when it comes to the US and China, you're going to be able to escape that sort of level of tension per se. And I avoid the term Cold War because I think that comes with too many connotations, and I think this is slightly different. I know other analysts do use the term Cold War. You know, Daniel Yergin uses the term New Cold War between Russia and China and so forth. I don't want to sort of use that term per se, but what you're getting here are shifts that, although they've been ameliorated with energy because of shale and American abundance, so forth, as we move into things like electrification, there are going to be battles over lithium, cobalt, you know, rare earth metals that, frankly, are more, ironically, are more geolocated than before. You know, various, you know, the Congo, for example, China itself. And getting access to those rare earth metals has the potential to become incredibly problematic, just because of the way in which you're going to get commodity wars and battles occurring along those lines. So that's the material basis, but the ideational basis, of course, is going to be something different, in that China wants supreme sovereignty, Russia wants supreme sovereignty, the United States wants to perpetuate a form of globalization with you know, various values attached to it. And so that's where you're going to get these international norms challenged and some pushing and shoving sort of going along, because there is no consensus. In terms of a third party being able to sort of adjudicate this, you know, we have a sort of international society, if you like, but the rules of that break down, as we're seeing with Russia.
Right. And okay, thank you. I've got some more questions that I'd like to ask, but we got a question from a very good old friend from my university days, Rashmi Bhardwaj, who says it's a great presentation, Oz, and says, as a result of these events, do you think global trade will see a sort of shift of currencies away from the US dollar towards a Chinese yuan,
Yeah.
and hence counteracting US dollar predominant in global trade and their ability, therefore, to apply sanctions?
I think that that's already beginning. We're starting to see that previously we started to there's been, for the last decade or 2 decades, there's been discussion about that, certainly within things like oil. Saudi Arabia is already having discussions with China about how it can pay not using the dollar. So all of a sudden, the one can be used, potentially, we haven't got there yet, but as in exchange for energy that way. So that goes back to that question about Saudi-Chinese relationships, that actually the Saudi Arabia are willing to weaken the dollar, the international currency, precisely because that they are having negotiations and discussions about, right, how do we shift over to China and allow China to have greater access to our energy. So we will see a depletion in that way. I think that, my understanding is that India is also looking to purchase Russian energy use it. I can't remember if it's which currency it was actually that was going to pay it, but I believe it was going to pay in the rupee.
Yeah.
So there are various things that are already beginning to appear that are a double-edged sword of sanctions. Sanctions, there are costs to sanctions to Europe and the US, and to the US, that is one of the costs, is a weakening of the US dollar.
Thank you, Oz. We got a question from a friend, a guest, Juliet Dyke, who enjoyed your presentation and asks, what do you think about the question that Russia may listen to the UN in regard to the present conflict with the Ukraine?
It's a tricky one. I mean, my overall view is that Russia, Russia has not taken the UN's process seriously so far. Yeah. So I don't see why it would now. I think what's going to change Russian calculations are ultimately the Russian population itself and the economic stress that Russia gets placed under as a result of sanctions. Now, unfortunately, that means that the European dependency on Russian energy is going to have to be part of that 6th round of discussions that the European Union gets into.
Isn't the logic of the position that you're arguing that given Russia's weakness and likely continuing weakness, that actually there's an incentive for them to colonize or recolonize the Ukraine?
I think there is. Yeah, I think that was the ambition. I think that was ultimately the ambition in the beginning, is that you sort of treat it as a vassal state, whether it gets completely submerged into Russia itself or just becomes a sort of entity with someone installed that is sympathetic to Russia. That it was ultimately the plan. I think the cost of that is now changing, given the resistance on the ground that Russia is facing. And the longer this goes on, the more that calculation begins to change away from colonization.
Just since there's no other questions in the Q&A at the moment, I'll ask another one, which is, okay, you looked at talk about these 3 blocks, and there's sort of certain level of fluidity there, as you said, but you looked at this group you called non-aligned. I just wondered, could you just say, I know probably it's not the same as the Cold War version of the non-aligned movement, but is this a viable sort of emergent self-conscious bloc of countries with common interests which don't fully align with the US and EU and or with China and Russia?
So if we go back to the abstentions at the UN, I believe all 30 bar China were part of that original non-aligned group. I'd have to check, but I think they were.
Right.
And I don't necessarily think it's conscious, but say, for example, we take India. India has its own interests, right? And when it comes to energy, what energy transition looks like in India is clearly not the same as what energy transition looks like in Germany. So India has got its own interests, and that may well be, you know, moving from biomass, which people still use as fuel in their homes, which comes with various pollution and medical problems, to health problems associated with it. You know, a energy transition for India, for example, looks like getting bottles of blue gas and giving them out to homes. So it has a fundamentally different sort of interest there than it does elsewhere. So it's going to try and balance out, which is going to be very tricky given you know, various skirmishes with China. It's going to try and balance out, you know, its interests in the United States, its interests with Russia, and its interests or competition with China. And so that's the sort of dynamic you've now got. And this is what I mean by the introduction of a greater level of geopolitics is really beginning to occur. And if anything, I think India could emerge as the leader of that non-aligned bloc as a conscious entity, given its history.
Right. Thank you. We're rapidly running out of time, but we got 2 minutes left only. There's a question from Maria Ryan, a good friend from Nottingham, who says, is this now likely to lead to fewer American military interventions in the Middle East and possibly a withdrawal of many of its bases in that region?
No. This was the argument I made in my PhD, is that yes, the United States has energy interests in the Middle East, but those energy interests have never been particularly for the United States itself. It is to ensure that there is a position of strategic reach. You know, if you're going to sort of start defending Taiwan, for example, the Middle East allows you to do it from the east and west, if you like, so you can have that. So that geostrategic reach, and military bases in Qatar, for example, and so forth, they are an important part of the US global strategy. What may change is the nature of what the US will tolerate within the Middle East. So, and I think that we've begun to see that with the, well, we saw that momentarily with the Jamal Khashoggi case, but that in itself is getting eroded. And so I think that that's where we're sort of at, but its interests in the the US interests in the Middle East go way beyond energy.
Right. Oz, it's 5:29. We're done. There are other questions actually, but I know you have a time constraint as well. And I want to be able to say thank you to you directly. I would like to ask the question, when's the book coming out? Because I think this is a really powerful analysis that you put forward. It has all kinds of repercussions for how to think about where the world is headed. And I think your research in a way has added a layer, certainly to my own knowledge about things, which wasn't there before in anything like that way that you put it. So I think it's going to complexify global relationships, and certainly has complexified my understanding of the Ukraine-Russia conflict as well. So thank you very much. Really eye-opening, really insightful, really deeply researched. Just the kind of model, kind of academic scholarly lecture that we need at this kind of time. So thank you very, very much for joining us today and for this wonderful lecture. Really appreciate it. Really owe you a debt of gratitude. And you know, you drew an audience over 30 plus in a day of in a period of Zoom fatigue and so on and so forth that we hear about. But I think everybody's going to go away very happy and satisfied. You've stimulated loads of ideas and questions and thoughts, and I'm sure people will get in touch with you as well. But thank you to the audience for sticking with us too and joining us today. as I said, on the 8th of April, we have a global webinar. We're going to complexify perhaps or add perspectives from different global locations on this big question of the Ukraine crisis as well. So again, Oz, thanks very much. Thanks to our questioners and thanks to the audience. And we will see you again in this space very soon. Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.